Inside Stalingrad, 300,000 trapped men are starving. And on the night of December 19th, 1942, some of them can see flashes on the southern horizon. Artillery fire, close enough to make out, from a relief force fighting its way toward them. For a few days, rescue feels close enough to touch. Then the flashes stop getting closer. Then they stop entirely. This is the story of Operation Winter Storm, the last real chance to save the 6th Army, and the single tank division that got closer to pulling it off than anyone thought possible, before being ordered to turn around 48 kilometers short. Later in this video, we're going to look at the exact moment this relief force reached its closest point to the trapped army. So close that no obstacle stood between them and Stalingrad, and the brutal, almost cruel reason it still wasn't enough. But to understand how close this actually came to working, we need to look at just how badly the numbers were already stacked against it before the operation even began. When the 6th Army was fully encircled in late November 1942, roughly 300,000 German and Romanian soldiers were trapped inside Stalingrad. Hitler refused to authorize a breakout, insisting the pocket could be supplied entirely by air instead. That plan failed almost immediately. The trapped forces needed around 700 tons of supplies delivered daily just to function, and the Luftwaffe managed to deliver only a small fraction of that, roughly 100 tons on an average day. Within 2 weeks, men inside the pocket were already running critically short of food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, newly placed in command of the army group responsible for the region, understood there was only one real option left. Break through from the outside, force open a corridor, and get the 6th Army moving south to link up with a relief force. The original plan called for 2 simultaneous thrusts, but Soviet pressure elsewhere tied down every unit available for the shorter route, leaving only one viable option: a single armored division launching from much further away, facing a far longer and more exposed route across open steppe. That division was the 6th Panzer Division, recently rebuilt to close to full strength in France, and equipped with newer vehicles than most of what Germany had left on the Eastern Front. Its armored regiment fielded roughly 160 tanks, a genuinely large force by the standards of the Eastern Front in late 1942. But the composition mattered enormously. The majority of those tanks were older models armed with a gun that struggled to penetrate the Soviet T-34's front armor at any real distance, reliable only at close range, and even then prone to deflecting off sloped armor. Only a smaller number of more modern tanks in the regiment carried a gun capable of engaging T-34s frontally at a safer distance. Add brutal winter conditions, engines needing half an hour just to warm up, optics fogging over, grease freezing solid in turret mechanisms, and this single division was being asked to cover roughly 120 kilometers of open, hostile terrain, with most of its own tanks technically outgunned by the enemy armor they'd be facing along the way. Here's the payoff from the teaser. The offensive launched on December 12th, catching Soviet command by surprise. They'd expected any relief attempt to come from a different direction entirely, and that miscalculation bought the German spearhead an unusually easy first day, advancing nearly 50 kilometers before serious resistance formed. What followed was a brutal, days-long armored battle around a village that sat on the only usable road north, repeated attacks and counterattacks, tanks fighting by day, and crews sleeping in frozen vehicles between engagements, wounded men left in the open, sometimes freezing to death, before help could reach them. By December 19th, with flanking divisions finally covering their exposed sides, the spearhead punched forward again and seized a bridgehead across the last river barrier before Stalingrad. In one engagement during that push, this single division's tanks destroyed dozens of Soviet tanks in a single close-range battle. They were now 48 kilometers from the trapped 6th Army. For the briefest window, there was genuinely no major obstacle left standing between the relief force and the men waiting inside the pocket. This is where the story turns from a remarkable advance into a genuine tragedy. The tanks that had fought their way to the river were almost entirely unsupported. The infantry needed to actually hold and extend that position were still many kilometers behind, fighting their own way forward, while other divisions were tied down protecting the relief forces' increasingly exposed flanks. Fuel and ammunition were both running critically low, with no realistic way to resupply fast enough to press the final distance alone. Manstein sent an officer into the Stalingrad pocket by light aircraft to deliver the plan directly. The Sixth Army needed to break out southward right now to meet the relief force part way. But the Sixth Army's commander reported his remaining tanks had only enough fuel to travel roughly 30 kilometers. The relief force was 48 kilometers away. That left an 18-kilometer gap that neither side had the fuel, strength, or authorization to close, a distance that, under almost any other circumstances, would have been utterly trivial for two determined military forces to bridge, and instead became the exact margin between rescue and disaster. At almost the same moment this relief force reached its closest point, a separate Soviet offensive tore through Axis forces on the flank far to the northwest, opening a massive gap that suddenly threatened to cut off an entire other section of the German front. Manstein now faced two crises simultaneously, and he had exactly one mobile, still combat-capable division that could plug the new gap. The same division sitting at the river, 48 kilometers from Stalingrad. On December 23rd, orders went out for one final all-out push with everything the division had left. That same afternoon, a second order arrived, canceling the first. The division was to disengage immediately and pull back west to deal with the new crisis instead. The relief attempt was over. According to a first-hand account later written by one of the division's own officers, soldiers understood immediately what the withdrawal meant. Even without being told directly, something had gone badly wrong at a much higher level for command to abandon hundreds of thousands of trapped men, and everything they'd fought and bled for over the previous 11 days suddenly felt like it had counted for nothing. The division that had come so close to reaching Stalingrad didn't get any real rest after the withdrawal. It was thrown almost immediately into fresh defensive fighting elsewhere along the collapsing front. Within about 3 weeks of the operation beginning, its armored regiment had been reduced from roughly 160 operational tanks to barely 10. Inside the pocket, the Sixth Army held out for another 5 weeks after the relief attempt was called off. When organized resistance finally ended in early February 1943, roughly 91,000 German soldiers went into Soviet captivity. Around 27,000 of them died within weeks of capture, and fewer than 6,000 ever made it back to Germany at all, most not until a full decade later, in the mid-1950s. The 48-kilometer gap that couldn't be closed in December 1942 turned out to be the difference between rescue and one of the most catastrophic losses of the entire war. A few facts worth knowing. One of the division's own tank commanders became the operation's primary historian. An officer who commanded a company during the offensive later wrote what remains one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of the entire operation, drawing on his own memory alongside war diaries and radio logs, published in Germany roughly a decade after the war, under a title that translates to 48 kilometers to Stalingrad, naming the exact distance that came to define the entire tragedy. The division's commanding officer met with Manstein just days before the offensive began, in a meeting he later described in strikingly grim terms. Manstein reportedly laid out the situation in unusually somber language for a briefing meant to send a division into battle, an early sign of just how desperate the overall military situation already was. The relief force was fighting before it had even finished unpacking. The division's first trainload of troops arrived at its staging point and came under artillery fire almost immediately, with soldiers reportedly jumping from railway wagons into combat before the unit had properly assembled. Soviet command's own miscalculation briefly worked in Germany's favor. Because Soviet planners had anticipated a relief attempt from a different, more obvious direction, the actual line of attack caught them off guard just long enough to gain real ground in the operation's opening day, a rare moment where German fortunes briefly improved due to enemy misjudgment rather than their own overwhelming strength. It's tempting to read this as a story about German tanks almost saving the day, or Soviet forces narrowly stopping them, but the more honest takeaway sits somewhere less triumphant. Manstein's plan worked about as well as a plan built on this little manpower and this much distance possibly could have. The spearhead achieved genuine surprise, fought through brutal winter conditions, and reached the last natural barrier before its target. And it still wasn't enough, because the war around this one operation refused to hold still long enough for it to finish. A second Soviet offensive elsewhere forced Germany's hand at the worst possible moment, and the trapped army itself simply didn't have the fuel left to cover its half of the remaining distance. 18 kilometers in almost any other context is nothing. Here, it was the entire war. Somewhere inside Stalingrad, in the days before the withdrawal order, soldiers watched flashes of artillery fire on the southern horizon and let themselves believe rescue was close. For a few days it genuinely was, closer than most people today realize. Then a single cancelled order, driven by a crisis hundreds of kilometers away, turned the closest realistic chance to save the Sixth Army into the exact distance historians still use to describe how narrowly and how tragically this rescue failed. If you want to see what happened to the men left behind after this operation ended, let me know in the comments, because the final weeks of the Stalingrad pocket are one of the grimmest chapters of the entire war.